Linda froze. At 71, she was just a night cleaner. But in that moment, none of that mattered, because right in front of her, on the wall, was a photograph. And the woman in that photograph looked exactly like her. Same face, same eyes, same lines shaped by time. Linda slowly stepped closer, her hand trembling. That's not possible. She leaned in, studying every detail. And the more she looked, the more certain she became. That woman looked like she could be her. So she whispered, "If that woman isn't me, why does she look exactly like me?" A cold wind moved through the quiet suburban street. But inside one small, worn-down house, something heavier than the cold had already settled. Silence that had nowhere to go. Linda Parker was 71 years old, and life had not ended for her. It had simply narrowed, tightened, and quietly taken things away one by one until almost nothing remained. She was a small woman, slightly hunched now with age, her posture softened by years of quiet endurance rather than weakness. Her hair, once a deep chestnut brown, had faded into a thin, uneven gray that she kept loosely tied back, though strands always slipped free, as if even they had grown tired of holding on. Her skin carried fine lines shaped not just by time, but by years of worry she had never spoken out loud. Her hands, rough and trembling slightly, were the kind of hands that had once been depended on, hands that had cooked, cared, comforted, and held a family together, even when no one noticed. There was a time when people relied on her, when her presence meant something. The house no longer reflected that life. The wooden floor creaked with every step. The wallpaper had peeled into curling edges, and the faint smell of dampness lingered no matter how often she cleaned. It wasn't neglect, it was simply time winning, slowly and without resistance. She shared the space with Margaret Collins, a woman in her late 60s whose illness had worn her down faster than age ever could. Margaret had a narrow face framed by short silver hair, her body thin beneath layers of blankets, but her eyes remained warm, quietly observant, as if she still held on to a version of the world that was kinder than the one they now lived in. "You're leaving again tonight?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but edged with concern. Linda adjusted her coat, pausing briefly as a dull ache moved through her shoulder. "Just for a few hours," she said gently. "It's not much, but it keeps things going." They both knew what that meant. Electricity, groceries, medicine, survival measured in small, fragile pieces. For a moment, Linda glanced toward the small kitchen table. There were 2 plates sitting there. She hadn't noticed when she set them out. Quietly, almost without thinking, she walked over and removed one. She didn't say anything about it. She rarely did anymore. Her husband had been gone for over 15 years. A steady man, not loud, not dramatic, but present in a way that made everything feel anchored. Losing him had not been a single moment, it had been a slow fading, one she had watched helplessly until even the silence he left behind felt louder than his voice ever had. After that, the house changed, and over time, so did everything else. Her children, once the center of her world, had moved away into lives that no longer had space for her. Calls became occasional, then rare, then gone. Linda had stopped expecting them long before they actually stopped. Blame required energy, and she had learned to live without it. The bus ride into the city felt longer than it actually was. Linda sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, watching the blur of streetlights pass like moments she no longer belonged to. People sat around her, quiet, distant, each carrying their own invisible weight. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She understood. She wasn't afraid of the work. She was afraid of what it meant. The office building stood tall against the night sky, its glass reflecting lights that made it look clean, distant, almost unreal. Linda hesitated briefly at the entrance before stepping inside, as if crossing that threshold meant accepting something she had been trying not to name. Inside, everything was controlled. The air, the lighting, even the silence felt intentional. She was handed her cleaning cart by Daniel Brooks, the night shift supervisor. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a tired, unshaven face and a voice that carried more impatience than anger. His short hair was slightly disheveled, his posture rigid, and there was something about him that suggested a man who had stopped expecting things to improve. "You're new," he said, barely glancing at her. "Try to keep up, we're short tonight." Linda nodded quickly, gripping the handle of the cart. "I'll do my best." "Yeah," he replied flatly. "Just don't fall behind." The work began quietly, but her body noticed everything. The strain in her back came first, then the ache in her knees, then the slow, creeping fatigue in her hands. It wasn't the kind of exhaustion that arrived suddenly. It built, layer by layer, until even small movements required effort. Still, she didn't stop. She couldn't. About an hour in, Daniel returned, his eyes scanning the area. "You're behind," he said. "Take the upper floor too. It needs to be done." Linda hesitated, just for a second. Her grip tightened slightly on the cart. For a brief moment, she thought about saying no, about explaining, about asking for something, anything, less. But she knew what that would cost her. "Okay," she said softly. Daniel had already turned away. She pushed the cart toward the elevator, her arms heavier now, her breath just slightly uneven. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the metal surface. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. When had that happened? When had she become someone who no longer questioned anything? The elevator opened to the top floor. The space was different, not just quieter, but still. The kind of stillness that felt deliberate, almost watchful. The offices were larger, the lights softer, everything placed with careful precision. Linda stepped forward slowly, her footsteps echoing faintly in the empty hallway. And then, she stopped. Not because of something she saw, but because of something she felt. Her hand tightened slightly around the cart as she looked down the corridor, a strange sensation rising somewhere deep inside her chest. It wasn't fear, it wasn't recognition, it was something in between, like standing at the edge of a memory that refused to fully return. Linda frowned slightly, shaking her head as if trying to push the feeling away. "It's nothing," she whispered. But as she took another step forward, the feeling didn't leave. It stayed with her. And somewhere, deep inside, something long forgotten shifted. The hallway on the top floor remained still long after Linda stepped out of the elevator, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And for reasons she could not explain, that silence pressed against something deep inside her, something old and fragile that had not been touched in decades. Linda stood there longer than she should have, her hands resting on the handle of the cleaning cart, her body present, but her mind drifting somewhere just out of reach, as though a door inside her had been nudged open, but not enough to see what was behind it. She moved forward slowly, pushing the cart down the corridor, the wheels making a soft, rhythmic sound against the polished floor. Yet each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion alone, but from a strange tension building beneath her chest. It wasn't pain, and it wasn't fear. It was closer to confusion, the kind that comes when something almost makes sense, but refuses to fully reveal itself. She paused near a large office door, her eyes lingering on the surface longer than necessary, and for a fleeting moment, she felt as if she had stood in a place like this before, though she knew that couldn't be true. Linda had learned long ago not to trust memories that came without warning, because her memories were incomplete. There had always been a gap, not a simple forgetting, not the kind that comes with age, but a clean, silent absence, as if a part of her life had been removed before she was old enough to understand it. She could remember fragments of her childhood, scattered and disconnected, but anything before a certain point felt blurred, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She had tried, many times, to piece those fragments together, especially when she was younger, when questions came more easily than acceptance. But answers had never come. Only one image had ever remained with her, a woman. Not clearly, never clearly, just a presence. A figure that existed somewhere between memory and imagination, always just out of focus, like a face she almost recognized but could never fully see. Linda had spent years trying to recall that face, to sharpen it in her mind, to give it form. But no matter how hard she tried, it always slipped away the moment she reached for it. What she did remember was the feeling, warmth, and then fear. The memory came in flashes, not in order, not complete, but always the same pieces, repeating in different ways. Smoke filling the air, a sharp, burning smell that made it hard to breathe. Loud voices shouting over one another. Something falling, something breaking. And somewhere in the chaos, that woman again. Reaching, or was she pulling away? Linda never knew. The details shifted each time she tried to remember, as if her mind refused to settle on a single version of the truth. She had been very young, no more than 5 or 6, too young to understand what was happening, too young to hold on to it properly, and whatever came after had erased what little remained. She remembered being carried at some point, though she could never recall by whom. She remembered cold air against her face after the heat. And then, nothing. When her life resumed, it was already somewhere else. Different walls, different voices, different hands. She had been told, in the simplest terms possible, that she had been found, that she was safe now, that there was no need to worry about what came before. The people who told her this had not been cruel, but they had not been gentle either. They spoke in practical tones, as if explaining something that did not require emotion, and over time, Linda had learned to mirror that same approach. Don't ask, don't remember, move forward. Her first foster home had belonged to a woman named Helen Carter, a tall, narrow-shouldered woman in her early 50s with tightly pinned brown hair and a face that rarely softened. Helen was not unkind, but she was strict, the kind of person who believed structure was more important than comfort. She kept her house spotless, her routines unchanging, and her expectations clear. Children, in her care, were to behave, to listen, and above all, to be grateful. Linda had been, or at least she had tried. She learned quickly that questions were not welcomed, especially questions about the past. When she once asked if anyone had come looking for her, Helen had simply replied, "If they had, you wouldn't be here." And that had been the end of it. No explanation, no softness, just a statement that closed the door on something Linda had not yet fully understood. After Helen, there were others. Different homes, different rules, different versions of what it meant to belong somewhere temporarily. Some families were kinder, offering small gestures of warmth that Linda held on to quietly, while others treated her like a responsibility rather than a child. Through all of it, she adapted. She learned how to read people quickly, how to adjust her behavior to fit expectations, how to make herself smaller when necessary. What she did not learn was how to hold on to her past. Over time, the questions stopped coming, not because they had been answered, but because they had nowhere to go. And eventually, even the memory of asking them faded. Years passed, life moved forward. School, work, marriage, children, each stage building on the last until the missing pieces felt less like something that needed to be found and more like something that had simply never existed. Linda did not think of herself as someone who had lost something. She thought of herself as someone who had never had it. But sometimes the feeling returned. Not often, not enough to disturb her life, just enough to remind her that something was still missing. It happened in small, unexpected moments. A stranger's face held a fraction too long, a voice that sounded familiar for no clear reason, a scent in the air that brought with it a sudden, unexplainable sense of déjà vu. And each time, Linda would pause, just briefly, as if something inside her was trying to surface. And then it would pass, like it always did, until tonight. Standing in that quiet hallway, Linda felt that same pull again, but stronger this time, sharper, more insistent. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cart as she looked ahead, her breath slower now, more deliberate. There was no sound, no movement, nothing outwardly different from the floors below. And yet, it felt different, familiar. Linda took another step forward, her eyes drifting toward the closed doors along the corridor, her chest tightening with something she could not name. For the first time in years, the feeling did not fade, it stayed. And somewhere, deep inside her mind, the edge of a memory, one she had never been able to reach before, began to take shape.
Michael Reed did not usually return to the office at night. Not anymore.
Not since the building had become less a place of ambition and more a quiet reminder of everything he had already achieved, and everything that had slowly lost its meaning over time. The city outside still moved with its usual rhythm, but inside the executive floor, the silence felt controlled, almost deliberate, the kind of silence that allowed thoughts to surface, whether they were welcome or not. Michael was in his early 40s, tall, with a lean, structured build that suggested discipline more than strength. His dark hair was neatly styled, though a few strands had begun to fall out of place over the years, not from neglect, but from the quiet pressure of a life lived constantly in control. His face was defined by sharp lines, a firm jaw, and eyes that carried a depth most people noticed but few understood. There was no softness in his expression, but neither was there cruelty. Instead, there was restraint, the kind that came from someone who had learned, early on, that emotions were something to be managed, not displayed. People respected him, some feared him, but very few knew him. He had built his company from something modest into something powerful, expanding it with careful decisions and an instinct for control that rarely failed him. Yet none of that was what defined him anymore. Not since his mother passed away 5 years ago. Her absence had not been loud, it had been quiet, and that was what made it unbearable. Her name was Eleanor Reed, a woman remembered by others as elegant, composed, and unwavering, but to Michael, she had always been something more complicated than that. She had been warm, yes, but there had always been something beneath that warmth, something fragile, something hidden. As a child, he had not understood it. As an adult, he had tried not to. Until now. Michael stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor, his footsteps echoing faintly against the polished surface as he walked down the hallway. He had come back for a file he claimed was important, though deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Sometimes, he returned simply because the office still held traces of her, small things, carefully preserved, that made it feel like she had not completely disappeared. He slowed as he approached the far end of the corridor. Someone was there. A woman. Cleaning. He almost walked past without looking. Almost. But something subtle, something instinctive, made him stop. Michael turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on the figure down the hall, and for a moment, nothing made sense. The woman was small, her posture slightly hunched, her movements slow but steady as she pushed a cleaning cart across the polished floor. Her hair, gray and loosely tied back, caught the soft light above her, and her face. Michael's breath caught. Not sharply, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to break the rhythm of everything he thought he understood. Because the face he was looking at was not unfamiliar. It wasn't just similar, it was precise. Too precise. His fingers tightened slightly at his side as he remained still, watching from a distance, his mind trying to process something it was not prepared to accept. He did not step closer. He did not call out. Instead, he observed, his eyes tracing the details carefully, as if afraid that one wrong movement would shatter whatever illusion he was seeing. It wasn't possible. He knew that. He understood coincidence, probability, the way the human mind searched for patterns where none existed. But this was different. Because it wasn't just her face, it was the feeling that came with it. Uninvited, uncontrolled, familiar. And suddenly, the past returned. Not in full, not clearly, but enough. Michael was no longer standing in a quiet hallway. He was a child again. The house had been dark, quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that made small sounds feel too loud. He had woken up in the middle of the night, not because of a noise, but because of something else, something he would not have been able to explain even then. He had walked down the hallway, his bare feet cold against the floor, drawn by a faint light coming from the living room. And there she was, his mother, sitting alone, not moving. At first he thought she hadn't noticed him, but then he heard it, a sound he had never expected from her, a quiet, broken breath, and then another. She wasn't just sitting, she was crying. Not loudly, not the kind of crying that demanded attention, but the kind that tried to stay hidden and failed. Michael had frozen in place, watching her from the hallway, confused in a way only a child could be, because this did not match the person he knew. His mother was composed, controlled, unshaken, except now, she wasn't. She leaned forward slightly, her hands covering her face as her shoulders trembled, and though he couldn't see her expression, he could feel the weight of something he didn't understand pressing into the room. "I'm sorry," she had whispered, not to him, not to anyone he could see. "I tried." Her voice broke. "I couldn't find her." Michael had not moved. He had not spoken. He had simply stood there, holding on to words he didn't understand, storing them somewhere in his mind without knowing why. The next morning, everything had returned to normal. She had smiled. She had spoken as she always did, and it had been as if the night had never happened. But Michael had remembered, even when he chose not to think about it, even when he told himself it didn't matter. Standing in the hallway now, years later, that memory returned with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. "I couldn't find her." The words echoed, not as sound, but as meaning, and for the first time, they connected. Michael looked back at the woman down the hall, at Linda, still unaware of him, still moving slowly, carefully, as if the world around her required quiet respect. His chest tightened, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something far more dangerous. Possibility. He took a step forward, then stopped, because this was not something that could be approached carelessly, not something that could be solved with a simple question. If he was wrong, it would mean nothing, but if he was right, it would mean everything. Michael remained where he was, watching her just a moment longer, his mind already moving, already calculating, already preparing for something he had not yet fully allowed himself to believe. And for the first time in years, the past was no longer something he could keep buried. Michael Reed did not act on impulse, not anymore. Not after years of building a life that demanded precision, restraint, and the ability to separate emotion from decision. And yet, ever since that night in the hallway, something had shifted in a way he could neither ignore nor fully control. He had seen Linda only briefly, had not spoken to her, had not even made his presence known, and still, the image of her face, so disturbingly familiar, had settled into his mind with a weight that refused to fade, returning again and again at the most inconvenient moments, interrupting his thoughts, altering his focus, reshaping his priorities in ways he had not anticipated. The next morning, Michael arrived earlier than usual. The building was quieter at that hour, the kind of quiet that belonged to preparation rather than exhaustion, and he moved through it with his usual composed stride, though his mind was far from its usual clarity. He entered his office without pause, closed the door behind him, and stood for a moment longer than necessary, as if gathering himself before crossing a line he had not yet fully acknowledged. Then, without hesitation, he pressed the intercom. "Send me human resources," he said, his voice steady, neutral, giving nothing away. Within minutes, the door opened again. A woman stepped inside. Clara Benson, head of human resources, in her late 50s, tall and composed, with short silver hair cut neatly around her face, and a posture that suggested both confidence and careful professionalism. Clara had worked with Michael for over a decade, long enough to understand his patterns, his silences, and the rare moments when something beneath the surface demanded attention. Her eyes, sharp but not intrusive, studied him briefly as she closed the door behind her. "You called?" she asked, her tone calm, efficient. Michael gestured lightly toward the chair across from his desk. "I need a file," he said. "An employee, cleaning staff. Name is Linda Parker." Clara did not react immediately, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, barely noticeable, but present. "That's specific," she replied, taking a seat, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Is there an issue?" Michael's gaze moved briefly toward the window before returning to her. "No issue," he said. "Just review." Clara held his gaze for a second longer than usual, then nodded once. "I'll have it sent up." She did not ask further questions. That was why Michael trusted her. When the file arrived, it was thinner than he expected. Too thin. Michael sat at his desk, the folder open before him, his eyes moving slowly across the pages, each line of information processed with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else in his life. And yet, with every detail he read, a quiet unease began to take shape. Name: Linda Parker. Age: 71. Employment: part-time cleaning staff, night shift. Medical notes: mild chronic conditions consistent with age. Next of kin: listed, but minimal contact. And then, nothing. No early records, no documented family history before adulthood, no consistent trace of origin. Michael leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the desk as he stared at the page, not because he did not understand what he was seeing, but because of what was missing. It wasn't unusual for records to be incomplete, but this was absence. Deliberate or otherwise, it created a gap that could not be explained by oversight alone. And for reasons he could not yet justify, that gap mattered. Michael closed the file slowly, not with frustration, but with a growing sense of caution, the kind that came when instinct and logic began to move in the same direction, but had not yet fully aligned. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. The same thought returned. Her face. And behind it, his mother's voice. "I couldn't find her." Michael exhaled slowly, then turned back. "Clara," he said into the intercom. She returned shortly after, her expression unchanged, though her attention seemed sharper now. "I want her reassigned," Michael said, his tone measured. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Reassigned?" "To the executive floor," he clarified. "Light duty, minimal strain." Clara's brows drew together just slightly, not in disagreement, but in curiosity. "She's not scheduled for that area," she said. "And we usually don't make exceptions unless there's—" "Make one," Michael interrupted, not harshly, but firmly. There was a pause. Clara studied him again, more carefully this time. "For her benefit?" she asked. Michael did not answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally. It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth. Clara nodded once. "I'll arrange it." When she left, Michael remained standing in the center of the room, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged, though something beneath it had begun to shift again, subtly but undeniably. He told himself this was practical, an adjustment, a reasonable decision, nothing more. But the truth was, he needed her closer. Not for answers, not yet, just closer. That evening, Linda noticed the change immediately. The supervisor who usually assigned her tasks, a stocky man named Daniel Morris, in his late 40s, with a rough voice and a habit of speaking more harshly than necessary, handed her a new schedule without explanation. Daniel had spent most of his life working physical jobs, his hands calloused, his patience worn thin by years of dealing with people who complained more than they worked, and though he was not cruel, he was not gentle either. Efficiency mattered to him. Results mattered. People's feelings did not rank high on his list. "You're moving upstairs," he said, glancing at the paper rather than at her. Linda blinked. "Upstairs?" "Executive floor," he confirmed. "Lighter work. Offices. Fewer areas." There was no explanation, no reason given, just a change. Linda looked down at the paper in her hands, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges as she read the new assignment again, as if expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something more familiar. But they didn't. "This is right?" she asked quietly. Daniel shrugged. "Came from above," he said. "Don't ask me." He moved on before she could say anything else. Linda stood there for a moment longer, the noise of the building continuing around her, but distant now, as if filtered through something else. Relief came first, a small, quiet release of tension she hadn't realized she had been holding for months. Her body would not have to endure the same strain. Her hands would not ache as much. Her breathing would not become as heavy by the end of each shift. And for that, she was grateful. But beneath that relief, something else stirred. A question. Why her? Linda folded the paper carefully, more carefully than necessary, and placed it into her pocket, her expression thoughtful, uncertain, but not resistant. For the first time in a long time, someone had noticed her, and she did not know what to do with that. The executive floor felt different that night, though nothing in its structure had changed, and Linda noticed it the moment she stepped out of the elevator, her hands resting lightly on the handle of the cleaning cart as she hesitated for just a fraction longer than usual, as if her body recognized something her mind could not yet explain. The hallway stretched before her in the same quiet elegance, polished floors reflecting soft amber light, closed office doors standing in perfect symmetry. Yet beneath that calm order, there was a tension she could not name, something subtle but persistent, like a distant echo pressing against the edges of her awareness. She moved forward slowly, her steps careful, her breathing steady but slightly heavier than it should have been. And though she told herself it was only fatigue, she knew it was not. The feeling had followed her since the reassignment, growing stronger with each passing night, settling somewhere deep inside her chest. Not painful, not frightening, but undeniably present. It was the kind of feeling that did not demand attention, but refused to be ignored. Linda reached the end of the corridor and stopped in front of a door she had been instructed to clean that evening. The CEO's office. She had been told it would be simple work, light work, dusting, wiping surfaces, organizing what little needed organizing. Nothing heavy, nothing difficult. And yet, as she stood there, her hand hovering near the handle, she felt a hesitation she could not justify. It was not fear. It was something else, something closer to recognition. Linda exhaled softly and pushed the door open. The office was large but not excessive, its space defined more by restraint than by luxury. Every object placed with intention, every surface clean, every line precise. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city beyond, light stretching into the distance like a quiet constellation, while inside, warm lamplight softened the edges of the room, giving it a stillness that felt almost personal. Linda stepped inside slowly, guiding the cart behind her, her eyes moving across the room with the quiet attention of someone used to noticing details others overlooked. The desk, the shelves, the arrangement of books, everything in its place, everything controlled. She began her work as she always did, methodical, careful, efficient, her movements small and deliberate, her focus grounded in routine. Wipe. Arrange, move, repeat. For a while, nothing happened. And then, she turned. It was not a dramatic movement, not sudden, not sharp, just a shift in direction. But the moment her eyes lifted toward the wall across the room, everything stopped. Linda did not move. Her hand remained where it was, resting lightly on the edge of the cart, her fingers curled just enough to hold her balance. Her breath caught somewhere between inhale and exhale as her gaze locked onto the image in front of her. A photograph, large, framed, centered. The woman in the photograph stood with quiet elegance, her posture composed, her expression calm but layered with something deeper, something not immediately visible but unmistakably present. And her face. Linda felt her heart stutter. Once, then again. No, it wasn't possible. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in an attempt to understand what she was seeing, as if clarity might change the truth of it. But it didn't. The face in the photograph was hers. Not similar, not familiar, identical. Linda took a slow step forward, her body moving before her mind could catch up, drawn by something she could neither resist nor explain, her chest tightening with each inch she closed between herself and the wall. Her heartbeat grew louder, not in sound, in presence, each pulse pressing against her ribs, echoing through her body with a rhythm that felt almost foreign. She stopped just in front of the photograph, close enough to see every detail: the curve of the cheek, the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw. It was all there, everything. And yet, this woman was not her. The hair was different, darker, the skin smoother, healthier, the expression softer, but the structure unmistakable. Linda raised her hand slowly, almost without realizing she was doing it, her fingers trembling just slightly as they moved toward the surface of the glass. She hesitated, for just a second, then touched it. The contact was light, barely there, but it was enough. Her fingertips rested against the cold surface, tracing nothing, feeling everything, as if through that thin barrier she might find an answer that had eluded her for a lifetime. Without thinking, her other hand lifted and moved to her own face, her fingers pressing gently against her cheek, mirroring the position of the hand against the glass, comparing, measuring, confirming what her eyes had already accepted, but her mind refused to understand. Her breathing shifted, shallow now, unsteady. "No," she whispered, though the word held no conviction. It wasn't denial, it was confusion. A confusion so deep it bordered on disbelief. Because she did not remember. She could not remember. And yet, something inside her did. A feeling, faint, distant, but real. The room seemed to tilt, not physically, but perceptually, as if the boundaries between past and present had softened just enough to let something through. Smoke. The thought came without warning, not as an image, as a sensation. Heat, pressure, noise, and somewhere within it, a shape, a presence, the same presence. Linda's hand slipped slightly against the glass. Her breath caught again. And suddenly, she was no longer standing in a quiet office. She was standing in something else, something older, something unfinished. Her body reacted before her mind could follow. She stepped back, quickly, too quickly, the movement unsteady, almost stumbling as her heel caught against the edge of the carpet, her hand reaching instinctively for balance, her eyes still fixed on the photograph, as if looking away would make it disappear. But it didn't. It remained, unchanged, unmoved, waiting. Linda shook her head once, sharply, as if trying to clear something from it, but the feeling did not leave. If anything, it deepened. For the first time in her life, the absence inside her did not feel like emptiness. It felt like something had been taken, something real, something important. And standing there, in a room that did not belong to her, looking at a face that should not have been hers, Linda felt it, not as a thought, but as a truth forming in silence. There was something missing from her life, and whatever it was, it had been here. Michael Reed did not approach Linda immediately after what she had seen in his office, not because he lacked the opportunity, but because he understood that timing mattered, and more importantly, that certainty mattered even more. The image of her standing in front of that photograph had stayed with him, though he had only witnessed it indirectly through the faint disturbance in the room and the subtle shift in her behavior afterward. Small details that most would overlook, but that Michael noticed with quiet precision. He had spent years learning to read people without asking questions, to understand what was spoken without words, and Linda, without realizing it, had begun to reveal more than she intended. For 2 days, he did nothing, at least nothing visible. He reviewed the file again, this time slower, not searching for new information, but for patterns, for inconsistencies, for anything that might confirm or deny what had begun to form in his mind. The absence in Linda's records no longer felt like a coincidence. It felt intentional, though he could not yet determine by whom or why. At the same time, the memory of his mother's voice returned with increasing clarity, not just the words, but the emotion behind them, the quiet desperation she had tried to hide, and the way it had broken through in those rare, unguarded moments. I couldn't find her. Michael closed the file again, his fingers resting against its edge, his gaze unfocused for a brief moment as the weight of that possibility settled more firmly into place. He needed to speak to her, not as a CEO, not as someone seeking answers, but as someone who might understand. That evening, he waited, not in his office, but in the hallway outside, positioned in a way that did not appear deliberate, though every detail of his presence had been carefully considered. The lighting was softer at that hour, the building quieter, and when Linda stepped out of the elevator, pushing her cart with the same slow, measured movement, Michael felt something tighten in his chest. Not uncertainty, but anticipation. She saw him. Of course she did. There was no avoiding that. And for a brief moment, something passed between them. Not recognition, not understanding, but awareness. Michael stepped forward first. "Mrs. Parker?" he said, his tone calm, respectful, deliberately neutral. Linda stopped. Her hands remained on the cart handle, her posture slightly stiff, her eyes lifting to meet his with a mixture of politeness and caution that came naturally to someone who had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where she did not fully belong. "Yes?" she replied softly. Michael offered a small nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work," he said. "I just wanted to check how you're adjusting to the new assignment." It was a simple question, safe, expected. Linda hesitated, but only for a moment. "It's easier," she said. "Thank you." Her voice carried sincerity, but also distance, as if she was unsure how much of herself was appropriate to reveal in this space. Michael noticed that. Of course he did. "I'm glad," he said, then paused, not long enough to create discomfort, but long enough to allow something else to enter the conversation. "It's important that we take care of the people who keep this place running." Linda gave a small nod, though her eyes shifted slightly, as if searching for something beneath his words. Michael took another step closer, closing the distance just enough to soften the formality of the moment. "If you don't mind me asking," he continued, his tone still gentle, still measured, "how long have you been doing this kind of work?" Linda's fingers tightened slightly around the cart handle. "A long time," she said. "Most of my life, I suppose." Michael inclined his head. "And before that?" The question was simple, but not easy. Linda did not answer immediately. Her gaze dropped, not in avoidance, but in thought, as if she was searching for something she could not quite reach. "I don't remember much from before," she said finally. Michael felt it, not as confirmation, but as alignment. "What do you remember?" he asked quietly. Linda exhaled softly, the sound almost inaudible, but heavy with something she did not fully understand herself. "Pieces," she said, "just pieces." Michael did not interrupt. He did not rush her. He waited. "There was a night," Linda continued, her voice slower now, more uncertain, as if each word required effort. "I don't know where, I don't know why, but there was smoke and noise, people shouting." Michael's jaw tightened slightly. He kept his expression neutral. "And a woman," Linda added, her eyes lifting again, though not fully focused on him anymore. "I think she was important, but I can't see her clearly." The hallway felt smaller, quieter. Michael did not move. "What happened after that?" he asked. Linda shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "It's like everything stops there, and then I'm somewhere else. Different people, different homes." Foster care. The word was unspoken, but understood. Michael's mind moved quickly, connecting details, aligning timelines, overlaying her fragmented memory with his own childhood recollections, and the overlap was no longer subtle. It was precise, too precise, but still not enough. He could not say it, not yet. "Do you ever try to remember more?" he asked instead. Linda gave a small, almost tired smile. "I used to," she said, "a long time ago." "And now?" She hesitated, then shook her head again. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "Whatever it was, it's gone." Michael felt something shift in his chest at that. Gone. That was what she believed. That was what she had accepted. And for a moment, he considered leaving it there, letting her keep that. But then, his mother's voice returned again, stronger this time. "I couldn't find her." Michael looked at Linda, really looked at her, not just at her face, but at the weight she carried without knowing why, at the quiet acceptance that had shaped her entire life, and for the first time, he understood something he had not allowed himself to see before. If he was right, then this was not just his past, it was hers too. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming before he could stop them. Linda blinked, slightly confused. "For what?" she asked. Michael paused, then shook his head slightly. "Nothing," he said. "I just appreciate you sharing that." Linda nodded, though her expression had changed just slightly. Something unsettled had entered it. Not fear, but awareness. The kind that comes when something long buried is touched, even briefly. "I should get back to work," she said. "Of course," Michael replied. He stepped aside. Linda moved past him, her cart rolling softly along the polished floor, but her posture was no longer as steady as it had been before. And Michael remained where he was, watching, thinking. For the first time, the question was no longer whether there was a connection, it was how deep it went. And somewhere behind him, in the silence of the hallway, the past waited. Not forgotten, not gone, just unfinished. Michael Reed had spent his entire life making decisions based on logic, discipline, and control. But there came a point where even the most rational mind could no longer silence what the heart refused to let go of. And for him, that moment arrived quietly. Not in a sudden realization, but in the accumulation of too many details aligning too perfectly to be ignored. He could no longer live in uncertainty, not when the possibility in front of him carried the weight of an entire lifetime. The next morning, his office felt colder than usual, though nothing in the room had changed, and Michael stood by the window longer than he intended, his reflection faintly visible against the glass as the city moved below him, unaware of the quiet decision that had just been made. He reached for his phone, his hand steady, his expression composed. But beneath that control was something else, something far more fragile. He contacted the legal department, not with urgency, not with explanation, but with precision. Within hours, the request had been quietly processed, and a man named Harold Whitman was assigned to the case. A senior legal advisor in his early 60s with a narrow face, neatly combed silver hair, and a habit of speaking only when necessary. His voice calm but firm, shaped by decades of navigating complex corporate and personal matters. Harold was known for his discretion, a man who understood that some truths were not meant to be handled carelessly. And when Michael explained what little he was willing to share, Harold did not question him. He simply nodded, as if he already understood the gravity of what was being asked. "I'll find what I can," Harold said. And he did. Days passed, quietly, efficiently. Files were retrieved, records examined, old reports uncovered, fragments of a past that had never been fully resolved. And then, there it was, a gap. Not a missing page, not an error, a gap. A child, unconfirmed, unaccounted for. Not recorded as found, not recorded as lost, just absent. Michael stared at the document for a long time, his eyes moving across the same lines again and again. Not because he didn't understand what they meant, but because understanding them changed everything. He did not speak. He did not react. But something inside him shifted. There was no longer doubt, only the need to know for certain. And certainty required proof. The next step had to be careful, invisible. So he designed it that way. A company-wide health initiative, voluntary, comprehensive, presented as a benefit. Routine checkups, screenings, and included within it, DNA testing. No one questioned it. Why would they? It was generous, forward-thinking, responsible. Exactly the kind of decision expected from someone like Michael Reed. Linda Parker received the notice like everyone else. A simple form, a scheduled appointment. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. And yet, when she read it, her fingers lingered on the paper just a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes scanning the words again, not searching for meaning, but reacting to something she could not fully explain. Health screening, routine, recommended. She exhaled softly. At her age, health was no longer something abstract. It was immediate, unpredictable, and quietly feared. If something was wrong, would she even be able to continue working? Would they keep her? Or would she become one more person quietly replaced, her absence unnoticed in a system that never stopped moving? Linda folded the paper carefully. She did not overthink it. She could not afford to. She signed. The day of the test came without ceremony. The medical team had set up in one of the lower conference rooms, temporary stations arranged with clinical efficiency, white partitions, soft overhead lighting, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. The process was simple, quick, almost impersonal. A woman named Dr. Emily Carter handled Linda's station, a woman in her early 40s with warm brown eyes, light freckles across her cheeks, and auburn hair pulled into a loose professional bun. Her voice gentle but practiced, someone who had spent years making strangers feel at ease in moments they didn't fully understand. "Just a quick sample," Emily said with a reassuring smile. Linda nodded. She sat. She followed instructions. A small swab. A simple action. And just like that, it was done. Nothing changed, and yet, everything had. Michael received confirmation that the samples had been collected. He said nothing. He asked nothing. He waited. Days stretched longer than they should have. Time moved differently when certainty was just out of reach. He continued his routine. Meetings, decisions, conversations, all executed with the same precision. But beneath it, every moment was divided. Before the result, after the result. When the notification finally arrived, it did not come with urgency. Just a message. Simple, direct, available. Michael did not open it. Not immediately. He sat in his office, the screen in front of him, the file waiting, and for the first time in years, his hands were not entirely steady. Because this was not business. This was not strategy. This was not control. This was something else. Something that could not be undone once seen. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes closing for just a brief moment as if preparing himself for impact. And then, he opened it. The words were clinical, precise, unemotional, but their meaning was not. Biological match. Sibling relationship confirmed. Michael did not breathe. Not at first. The room seemed to narrow, the edges of his awareness pulling inward as the weight of those words settled into him, not as information, but as reality. And then, it came. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once. Memory. His mother sitting alone in the dark, her shoulders shaking, the sound of her voice breaking as she tried to speak. I couldn't find her. The way she would stop, the way she would look away, the way she carried something she could never put down. Michael's hand moved to his face, pressing against his mouth as if to hold something back, but it didn't work. The first tear fell before he even realized it had formed. Then another. His breathing changed, uneven now, unsteady. The control he had built over decades dissolving in seconds under the weight of a truth he had not allowed himself to believe. All those years, it had not been grief without reason. It had not been pain without meaning. It had been her, Linda, his sister, lost, not gone, just waiting to be found. Michael lowered his hands slowly, his vision blurred, his chest tightening in a way he had never experienced before, not as a CEO, not as a man in control, but as something far simpler, far more human, a younger brother, who had finally found what his mother never could. His fingers trembled slightly as they rested against the edge of the desk, the quiet office around him unchanged, the city outside continuing as if nothing had happened. But everything had. And for the first time in his life, Michael Reed was no longer alone. Michael Reed chose his moment carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what was about to be revealed. And on a quiet late afternoon when the office had begun to empty and the world outside softened into a calm golden light, he asked Linda Parker if she would be willing to sit with him for a few minutes. Not as an employee, but simply as someone he wanted to speak with. Linda, still carrying the quiet unease that had followed her since the conversation in the hallway, agreed, though her hands felt slightly colder than usual, and her heart carried a weight she could not name. The room he brought her to was not his main office, but a smaller private meeting space, one with softer lighting and fewer distractions, where the city could still be seen through a wide glass window, but felt distant, almost removed from the moment. On the table between them sat a small wooden box, worn slightly at the edges, its surface marked by time rather than neglect, as if it had been opened many times and always closed with care. Michael did not begin immediately. He waited until she was seated, until the silence settled, until the moment felt steady enough to hold what he was about to say. "There are some things I need to show you," he said quietly, his voice controlled but softer than she had ever heard it before. Linda nodded, her eyes drawn not to him but to the box. There was something about it, something familiar, not in memory, in feeling. Michael reached forward and opened it slowly. Inside were objects that, to most people, would have seemed ordinary. A small silver locket, a faded photograph, several folded letters, their paper yellowed with age, and a piece of fabric, carefully preserved. Linda leaned forward slightly, her breath catching in a way she could not explain, her eyes moving across each item as if searching for something she had never consciously known. Then, she saw it, the locket. Her hand lifted almost without permission, hovering just above it before finally touching its surface, her fingers tracing its edges with a quiet familiarity that sent a subtle tremor through her body. "I've seen this before," she whispered, though she knew she hadn't. Not truly, not clearly, but something inside her recognized it. Michael watched her carefully, not interrupting, not guiding, allowing her to arrive at each realization on her own. "That belonged to my mother," he said gently. Linda's hand froze. Slowly, she looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no distance in her gaze, only confusion, and something deeper, something beginning to form. Michael reached for one of the letters and unfolded it with care, the paper fragile but intact, his fingers steady now not because he was calm, but because he had accepted what needed to be said. "She wrote these," he continued, "over many years." Linda swallowed, her throat dry. "Read it," Michael said softly, sliding the letter toward her. Linda hesitated, then took it. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the page, her eyes moving slowly across the words, each sentence pulling something from her that had been buried too deeply to reach before. "I'm sorry I couldn't find you." The words blurred, not because she couldn't see them, but because something inside her had shifted so suddenly that her body struggled to keep up. Her breathing changed, her chest tightened. "I never stopped looking." A tear slipped down her cheek before she even realized it had formed. Michael said nothing. He let the silence carry the weight. When Linda finally looked up again, her expression was no longer confused. It was breaking. "I don't understand," she whispered. Michael nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "That's why I need to tell you the rest." He paused, not for effect, but because even now, saying it out loud required something he had not needed to use in years. Vulnerability. "There was a fire," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the memory itself demanded respect. "The night you remember." Linda's eyes widened slightly. The fragments, smoke, noise, they returned instantly. "My mother got me out first," Michael continued. "I was still inside. I don't remember all of it, but I remember her going back." Linda's hand tightened around the letter. "She went back for me," Michael said. The words landed differently this time, not as information, as truth. "And when she came out," he added, his voice faltering just slightly, "you were gone." Linda shook her head once, instinctively. No, but the feeling, it was there. "She didn't leave you," Michael said firmly, his eyes holding hers now with a clarity that allowed no doubt. "She lost you." The distinction mattered, more than anything. "In the chaos," he continued, "I was taken to safety. She was injured, and when she came back to find you, you were already gone." Linda's breathing became uneven. Her mind struggled to hold the pieces together. "They told her," Michael's voice dropped slightly, "that no other child had been found." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had never been said. "She spent the rest of her life searching," he said, "writing, hoping, waiting." Linda looked down at the letter again, at the ink, at the words written by a woman she had never remembered, but who had never forgotten her. "I thought," Linda's voice broke, "I thought I was left behind." Michael shook his head. "No," he said, "you were loved." The words settled slowly, not all at once, but enough to begin changing everything. Linda closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders trembling as years of quiet acceptance began to shift into something else, something more painful, but also more complete: understanding. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with tears, but also clarity. "And you," she said softly, looking at him again, searching his face not just for resemblance, but for truth. "You're—" Michael nodded. Yes. He did not need to say the word. It was already there, between them, real, unavoidable. Family. Linda let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding for decades, her body relaxing just slightly as something inside her finally found a place to settle. For so long, her life had been shaped by absence, by questions without answers, by a silence she had learned not to challenge. And now, that silence had been broken, not with noise, but with truth. They sat there for a while, not speaking, not needing to, because for the first time, they were no longer alone in their past. And as the light outside faded into evening, casting softer shadows across the room, Linda realized something she had never allowed herself to believe before. She had not been forgotten, she had been lost, and now, she had been found.
Sometimes life hides its deepest truths behind years of silence, loss, and misunderstanding, but that does not mean those truths disappear. Linda spent decades believing she had been forgotten, carrying a quiet pain that shaped her entire life, while Michael lived with unanswered questions he never dared to fully face. Yet, in the end, what brought them back together was not luck, but the quiet persistence of love that never gave up, even when it seemed lost. Their story reminds us that no matter how late it feels, it is never too late for healing, for truth, or for family to find its way back together in a world that often moves too fast. We forget that every person carries a story we cannot see, and sometimes the greatest miracle is simply being seen, understood, and finally found. Maybe the story is not just a coincidence. Maybe it is a reminder that God is always working quietly in our lives, even when we cannot see it. Sometimes what we think is loss is simply a journey waiting to lead us back to where we truly back belong. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on someone you may have lost, someone you may need to forgive, or someone you should reach out to today. Comment where you are watching from and share your story. Tiny, like and share this video to spread hope. Subscribe for more meaningful stories. And may God bless you, guide you, and bring peace, healing, and unexpected miracles into your life.